When we gaze at the majestic silhouettes of lighthouses rising from the heart of a raging ocean, we feel as though we're witnessing the ultimate triumph of the Victorian spirit. But while official records paint a picture of 19th-century builders performing heroic feats, a closer look suggests we might be looking at one of the most massive cover-ups in technical history. We've been taught to trust textbooks filled with stories of brilliant engineers conquering the elements with nothing but pickaxes and wooden rowboats. But modern reality tells a very different story. Today, even a high-tech platform built with titanium alloys and satellite precision risks being obliterated by the first major storm in the exact spots where these ancient stone needles have stood firm for over 150 years. The official narrative claims these colossal structures were erected in the mid-1800s without the help of helicopters, floating cranes, or fast-setting concrete. Common sense, however, raises a red flag. It is physically impossible for a crew in rowing boats to approach a tiny, jagged rock, barely peeking out of the water, and build a 50-meter tower capable of shattering waves weighing hundreds of tons. This is where official history crashes head-on into the laws of physics and logistics. And in this debate, the science clearly isn't on the side of the historians. Take, for example, the legendary Amen Lighthouse in France. Records say construction began in 1867. We're asked to believe that brave men jumped onto slippery granite ledges during low tide to get the job done. But the numbers tell a stranger tale. In the entire first year, workers managed to land on the rock only 7 times. Their total time spent on-site over 12 months was a measly 8 hours. In that tiny window, they supposedly managed to drill foundation holes into granite that is harder than steel. Anyone who has ever tried to hand-tool wet stone while waist-deep in freezing water, facing an abyss that wants to swallow them whole, will tell you the same thing. This isn't just difficult, it is physiologically impossible for a human being. Yet the towers are there, and their existence demands a much deeper explanation than fairy tales about fishermen with shovels. When you dig into the construction budgets of that era, the inconsistencies are staggering. We're talking about thousands of tons of granite and cement. In the 19th century, there was no such thing as dynamic positioning for ships. Any attempt to bring a heavy, wooden sailing vessel close enough to offload materials onto a lonely rock in the constant swells of the Atlantic would have ended in a catastrophic wreck. Yet these lighthouses stand exactly where a modern project would require billions of dollars and cutting-edge technology, available only to the world's largest corporations. The foundation is perhaps the biggest mystery of all. Professional engineers know that the hydraulic concrete of that era couldn't possibly set under the constant battering of waves. To create a base at water level, you need a dry workspace for an extended period. Claims of some fast-setting cement from the mid-1800s fall flat, considering the technology of the time could barely build stable ports in calm harbors, let alone survive the aggressive salt and constant vibration of the open sea. Salt water should have dissolved the mortar within decades, yet the masonry of these structures looks monolithic, as if it were fused or cast rather than stacked from individual blocks. This leaves us with a haunting possibility: the use of stone-working methods that have either been lost to time or intentionally hidden from the world. When you dig into the official reports on how these massive lighthouses were built, you're hit with a chilling realization. The reality on the ground and the stories in the archives just don't match up. The construction of France's legendary Amen Lighthouse is the perfect example of this absurdity. According to the records, during their entire first year of work, the builders managed to set foot on the rock only 7 times. Their total time spent on site? A measly 8 hours. Think about that for a second. Historians claim that in just 8 hours of total work per year, these men managed to anchor themselves to slippery granite and drill deep foundation holes into rock that is as hard as steel. This isn't just a difficult task, it is a physiological impossibility when you're being hammered every single second by freezing, crashing surf. Working in those conditions would feel like being trapped in a literal living nightmare where the human element is reduced to zero. Yet, if we believe the official papers, this is exactly how foundations were laid, for towers meant to stand for centuries. There is a massive collision here between the laws of physics and 19th century logistics. To pierce granite with hand tools back in the mid-1800s, you would need weeks of non-stop labor from hundreds of workers, not short little bursts during low tide. Furthermore, the idea that someone could even survive on those rocks without modern safety gear or rescue teams is highly questionable. Interestingly, the official records are silent about mass tragedies or people losing their lives. It's as if these workers had the skills of modern special forces or simply never faced the ocean's true fury at all. The technology used to anchor these structures to the rock is equally suspicious. Old blueprints show massive wooden cranes fixed directly onto the granite outcrops. However, the physics of a lever are unforgiving. For a crane to lift a 2-ton block, the crane itself needs a powerful pivot point and a solid foundation. Creating that kind of anchor without power drills or chemical bonding agents is a slow, painstaking process that requires a perfectly dry environment and a lot of time, neither of which the builders had. It creates a logical loop. You can't build the foundation without the crane, and you can't install the crane without the foundation. When we look at these numbers and conditions, it becomes clear that the official history is bursting at the seams. We are being sold the image of a heroic stone mason who, against all logic and common sense, builds a monumental structure while standing waist-deep in water. But if you strip away the romantic storytelling, you're left with an impossible anachronism. Either 19th century humanity possessed hidden technologies that have been kept from us, or these structures were already there long before the first builders ever arrived. It is staggering that despite having almost no time to actually access the sites, the volume of material moved was colossal. Thousands of tons of granite blocks somehow had to end up on a tiny speck of land in the middle of a watery abyss. How exactly was this impossible delivery carried out when sailing ships were defenseless against jagged rocks, and any attempt to maneuver in the surf zone meant certain destruction for the crew and the cargo? Do you want to know how mathematical calculations and the laws of navigation finally shatter the myth of stone delivery via wooden schooners? When we shift from theoretical theories to the cold, hard numbers of logistics, the official construction story turns into a total mathematical absurdity. Just imagine the task, delivering over 6,000 tons of granite blocks to a tiny, jagged outcrop in the middle of the open ocean. In the 19th century, the only transport available consisted of wooden sailing schooners and barges. These vessels had no engines to hold them steady against powerful currents, and no sonar to spot the treacherous reefs lurking just beneath their keels. Mathematics is a stubborn science. Moving that volume of cargo would have required hundreds of individual trips. Every single one of those journeys through the raging Atlantic or the brutal English Channel was a high-stakes gamble with fate. Yet, according to official statistics, nearly all those thousands of tons were delivered and unloaded without a single lost ship or missing batch of material. For a sailing fleet of that era, where the wreck rate for standard trade routes was staggering, this level of precision looks supernatural. How were heavy blocks transferred from the deck of a ship, tossing on the waves onto a slippery rock? Any attempt to bring a schooner within arm's reach of those cliffs would have seen the ship smashed into splinters across the coast in the very first minute. But the actual structure of the masonry raises even more questions. This isn't just a pile of stones stacked on top of each other. Lighthouse blocks are joined using a dovetail principle, an incredibly complex interlocking system where every element fits into the next with millimeter precision. This system turns the tower into a monolith capable of withstanding colossal pressure, but it also turns construction into an impossible puzzle. Amidst constant storms, salt spray, and a total lack of heavy machinery, workers supposedly achieved a perfect fit for multi-ton stones that cannot be moved by hand even an inch. Modern engineers, analyzing these joints, are coming to a startling conclusion. This level of stonework is only possible using high-precision CNC machines. The surfaces of the blocks are perfectly smooth, and the geometry of the locks rules out the use of a simple chisel and hammer. If we assume each block was custom cut for its specific spot in a three-dimensional model, then we are looking at technology that is centuries ahead of the Victorian era. Furthermore, fixing these blocks in place required specialized compounds. The standard mortar of that time would have been washed out of the grooves faster than the builders could lay the next row. The internal structure of these lighthouses looks more like the components of a complex machine or even parts of a giant antenna, where every stone holds a strictly calculated place in a chain. Logic suggests that such objects aren't built from scratch in the ocean. They were either assembled like a pre-made kit from modules manufactured on the mainland, which is impossible given the weight of the blocks and the era's crane capacity, or they were built in entirely different climatic and geographical conditions. Everything points to the fact that we are looking at the work of an industrial civilization with incredible power, one that simply doesn't fit into the pages of our history books. And if delivering such cargo by water was impossible in the 19th century, only one logical explanation remains. When these towers were built, the water simply wasn't there. This thought leads us to an even more unsettling discovery. If these lighthouses were built on dry land, what happened to our planet, and why do the maps of previous centuries look so drastically different from what we see today? A shocking hypothesis that explains every single construction anomaly in one fell swoop sounds terrifyingly simple. When these colossal towers were being built, there was no ocean around them at all. Everything finally clicks into place if we acknowledge that the global sea level at the moment of construction was at least 100 meters lower than it is today. In this paradigm, these lighthouses stop being impossible objects and turn into ordinary high-rise structures built on solid ground, perched atop hills or rocky highlands. Modern hydrographic surveys of the seabed near the oldest lighthouses are yielding astonishing results. At depths of 50 meters or more, divers and deep-sea submersibles are documenting traces of machine-processed stone identical to the masonry found on the lighthouses themselves. These aren't chaotic natural formations. They are sharp geometric shapes resembling building foundations or infrastructure elements. Even more incredible is the discovery of mysterious straight lines on the ocean floor, wide, level paths stretching for dozens of kilometers, connecting the underwater bases of the lighthouses to the mainland. These sunken roads point to the existence of a unified logistics network, where multi-ton loads weren't moved by the whims of the waves on fragile schooners, but over land using ground transportation. If we look at the cartographic heritage of the past, we find even stranger details. On many maps from the 15th and 16th centuries, created with precision that was startling for that era, entire regions, cities, and fortresses are marked exactly where the sea abyss now gapes. Official science dismisses these as cartographers' errors or figments of the imagination, yet all too often these fantasies align perfectly with the real seabed relief revealed by sonar scans. In this coordinate system, lighthouses weren't warning signs for sailors, but hub points on high ground. The transition from land to water apparently happened catastrophically fast by historical standards. A global rise in water levels turned yesterday's hills into treacherous reefs and these majestic towers into lonely islands. The official history of the 19th century simply appropriated these objects, hastily inventing legends about heroic masonry builders. This allowed for the concealment of a massive catastrophe and the existence of a civilization whose technical capabilities allowed them to reshape planetary landscapes. However, if these structures were built on land as part of a global network, a logical question arises. Why build such strange, narrow, and incredibly strong towers on hilltops? Why is their internal layout so poorly suited for living and so closely reflective of the design of complex technical devices? The answer lies hidden in the physical properties of the materials themselves and the mysterious internal components of these objects, components that, at some point, became extremely hazardous for the new masters of the world. This is where we approach the most guarded secret of all, the true purpose of the lighthouses, which has absolutely nothing to do with sending light signals to ships. If you peel back the romantic curtain of the guiding light for sailors, you're left with structures whose architecture and internal design make absolutely no sense as simple lighting fixtures. Lighthouses are actually complex technical hubs, and their true purpose has been cynically hidden behind the primitive Fresnel lens. Take a closer look at the layout of these towers, the cramped spiral staircases, the total lack of basic comforts for long-term living, and the massive vertical shafts running through the entire building. This isn't a residence, it's the housing for a giant instrument. One of the most closely guarded secrets is the massive use of mercury in lighthouse construction. The official story claims that multi-ton optical systems floated in mercury baths to reduce friction. However, the sheer volume of this toxic metal used at these sites is mind-blowing. We're talking about tons of mercury in every single tower. From a physics standpoint, mercury is an ideal conductor and a perfect working fluid for creating vortex magnetic fields. Positioned at points of maximum crustal activity and surrounded by salt water, a natural electrolyte, lighthouses functioned as massive ether resonators. The lighthouse's internal shaft acted as a waveguide, while the metal-domed superstructure served as a receiver for atmospheric electricity. These structures were part of a global wireless energy transmission network, the very principles of which Nikola Tesla later tried to revive. The immense height and specific shape of the towers allowed them to accumulate a charge from the ionosphere, converting it into a focused energy beam. The light signal we see today is merely a byproduct or a downgraded function of a system that the world's new masters adapted for their own modest needs, simply because they didn't understand how to run the reactor at full capacity. The use of quartz glass and specific metals in the lining of the lantern rooms also deserves special attention. These are materials required for handling high-frequency radiation, not just for shielding a kerosene lamp from the wind. The very idea that humanity built such cyclopean structures just to light a candle at the top looks like a historical joke. It's like using a modern supercomputer as a coffee cup coaster. Lighthouses were nodes in a global power grid that provided free energy to the cities and transport of that forgotten civilization, whose traces we now find on the ocean floor. But there was a dark side to this. The operation of such a system created powerful fields that had a devastating effect on biological organisms. This is where we find the real answer to the countless legends about the madness of those who stayed inside these lanterns. Do you want to know what actually happened to the people inside these humming machines, and what price the keepers paid for standing in the epicenter of an invisible storm? Legends of lighthouse keepers losing their sanity have long been a staple of pop culture, but if you strip away the mysticism, what's left is a terrifying medical record. Official sources blame the mental breakdowns of the staff on isolation, the roar of the ocean, and the monotony of daily life. However, the actual symptoms recorded in logbooks go far beyond standard depression. Hallucinations, a complete loss of time orientation, sudden aggression, and physical exhaustion. These are the classic hallmarks of exposure to powerful electromagnetic fields and infrasound, not just simple loneliness. A person trapped inside one of these stone towers was effectively standing in the center of a functioning physical instrument. Lighthouses, built as giant acoustic resonators, featured complex systems of internal shafts and ventilation ducts. Under certain wind conditions and wave impacts, these hollow spaces would begin to generate infrasonic vibrations, frequencies the human ear cannot detect, but which trigger irrational terror and panic attacks. The towers were literally singing, and this resonance slowly dismantled the psyche of anyone inside. The mercury we discussed earlier played a particularly dark role in this curse. Tons of liquid metal sitting in open baths at the top of the tower were constantly evaporating. In a confined space with poor ventilation, keepers breathed in mercury vapors for decades. Chronic poisoning from this metal leads to severe damage to the central nervous system, the infamous Mad Hatter syndrome. But why did 19th century engineers, who were well aware of mercury's toxicity, continue to use it in such massive quantities? The answer is simple. Human safety was secondary to the necessity of keeping the power plant operational. The new masters of the world, who discovered these sites after a global catastrophe, tried to exploit them without understanding the safety protocols. They lit stoves inside rooms designed for sophisticated hardware and installed primitive oil lamps where ether energy used to concentrate. Staying inside a functioning ancient machine that people tried to tame with firewood and kerosene was a slow sentence of decline. These people weren't just standing watch. They were living inside a giant transmitter that continued to passively accumulate energy even after it was officially switched off. Many records mention keepers seeing strange glows around the towers on clear days when no lamps were lit. This phenomenon, known as St. Elmo's fire, reached terrifying proportions at lighthouse sites, indicating that the stone framework of the building was still interacting with the atmosphere. We are dealing with a cargo cult, people in uniforms trying to mimic the activities of a high-tech civilization, turning energy hubs into basic signal posts. This brings us to the final question. Who were the true, rightful owners of this infrastructure? And why is modern humanity trying so hard to pretend that all of this was the work of simple stonemasons with nothing but chisels in their hands? The true picture of human history over the last few centuries is far less triumphant than official sources like to paint it. We have been conditioned to see the 19th century as the era of steam and great discoveries, but the facts point to something else entirely. It was an era of global inventory and the appropriation of someone else's legacy. We inherited a planet littered with the wreckage and functioning infrastructure nodes of incredible power, which we, like children finding a broken smartphone, have adapted for our own primitive needs. Lighthouses are just the tip of this technological iceberg, impossible to hide or tear down due to their colossal strength and monumentality. It was easier to rename them, invent legends about heroic masonry builders, and weave them into a new, correct chronology. We are living in a reality of total cargo culting. Just as isolated tribes might build airplanes out of straw, hoping the gods will send supplies, our society uses ancient cathedrals, star forts, and ocean towers without understanding their true purpose. Where wave resonators and free energy transmitters once functioned, we now hang bells or light kerosene burners. Official history methodically turns us into a people without a past. We are told that the planet's greatest structures were built solely for religious ecstasy, or in the case of lighthouses, to save a few fishing boats. But does it make sense to spend the resources of an entire empire to erect a 6,000-ton granite needle in the middle of a watery nightmare just to shine a flashlight? We have been given an inferiority complex regarding our ancestors, while their true greatness has been hidden, reducing all their achievements to a simple chisel and hammer. When you consider that lighthouses actually sit on the peaks of sunken hills, the scale of the catastrophe hidden from us is staggering. Beneath the water lie not just ruins, but entire cities and communication lines that once connected these sites into a single planetary grid. Today, we are a civilization of scavengers setting up house in an abandoned palace, using gold bars as bricks for a hearth. We look at the architecture of the past and see beauty when we should be seeing the functional schematic of a high-tech system. The veil of secrecy over lighthouses is just one layer of a global deception. Our past was altered to control our future and keep us trapped in a scarcity-based economy where energy must be paid for, even though it is literally vibrating in the air around us. But the ocean continues to keep its secrets, and every storm that shatters modern titanium structures only confirms one thing. We are still far from the level of mastery possessed by the true owners of this world. Look at these stone towers once more. They don't ask for salvation, and they do not fear time. They are waiting for the day we stop being mere users of someone else's property and finally find the courage to face the truth about who we were before the waters hid our roads, and who we are now on these jagged shores of forgotten history.
Subscribe, because what comes next is something you've never heard before.